Yo, how's it going, everybody? Today we're going to do another video. This time we're going to actually be talking about the fantasy football terminology. This is mostly going to be for those who are trying to get into fantasy football, don't really have a lot of experience with fantasy football, and they hear some people talking about some terms and are like, what is that? Well, this video is definitely going to be for you. We're going to break down most of those terms so that we can kind of explain to you guys what they mean, how they relate to fantasy football, and that way maybe you can sound a little bit smarter at your draft when everybody's talking all this lingo. So without further ado, let's get into the first term. We're going to go to the very basics and talk about just a standard league. What is a standard league? Sometimes you see STD there for standard league, but you have a different kind of leagues that you can play in. And the standard league is mostly for, you don't get any points or extra points if somebody catches the ball. I know there's all types of rules out there. You have to look at your specific league schedule, but there's some leagues that even give points for running the ball or catching the ball, a certain amount of points to catch the ball, certain points for a touchdown, 6 points for a touchdown, 4 points for a touchdown. You just have to look at it. But a standard is kind of like the vanilla part of fantasy football. You don't get any extra points for catching the ball. You get pretty much 1 point for every 10-yard rushing, or 1 point for every 10 yards receiving, or 1 point for every 20 to 25 yards passing. That's kind of a standard league. That's your kind of a basic league. So let's move on to the other kind of league, and let's talk about a PPR league. PPR stands for points per reception. So normally, if a receiver or a running back catches the ball, or even a tight end, they catch the ball, they receive 1 extra bonus point for catching the ball. So let's say that somebody catches a 10-yard pass. Well, you get 1 point for catching the ball, and you're also going to get 1 point for 10 yards receiving. So on that play alone, your player just got 2 points. Okay, so let's talk about another term. We're talking about half PPR. That means they get a half a point per reception. So in the same scenario, let's say your receiver caught a 10-yard catch. So he gets a half a point for the reception, and he gets 1 point for having 10 yards receiving. So that ends up being 1.5 points for that play. So I hope that kind of clears up a little bit between standard, PPR, and half PPR. Those are the most common types of leagues that you're going to be seeing in. I know probably the most people maybe go towards the half point per reception leagues. I know I like to play, and a lot of my videos are based on PPR leagues. Don't play in a lot of standard leagues. I really like having the extra bonus point for catching a pass. So let's move on to another term that I know a lot of people have some confusion on, and we're going to talk about ADP. Now, ADP is going to be one of those things. It stands for average draft position, and it's going to be very important for your success in fantasy football, in my personal opinion. Average draft position is pretty much, it's a sum of tons of drafts per site. Whether you're an Underdog Fantasy or FantasyPros or whatever, they have their own ADP, average draft position, to where all the mock drafts, they can do hundreds of mock drafts, and they take all the sum of all of those and they average them out based on the players that are getting taken. So for some reason, let's just talk about Jonathan Taylor for some reason. Let's say he's the #1 overall consensus. Most people are taking him #1 overall in your drafts. Well, he's going to be draft pick 101, which means the first pick in the draft, averaged draft position as the #1 guy. So I hope that kind of helps you out a little bit, but you can go through all ADP, and that way whenever it's your turn to draft, you can see the average ADP for what per se player, and then you can draft accordingly per that. So for instance, in your first round pick, you don't want to take someone whose average draft position in the 10th round. That doesn't make sense. You can take him probably in the 8th round if you want to go a little bit above ADP to make sure you get your guy. But you want to kind of gauge that. You want to draft people in the first round who have maybe a first or second round ADP, and kind of keep it between a round apart for that. So that way you can get the best value and the best team possible based on how most people are drafting. And again, your leagues may be different. We're not sure. People draft a lot differently. So you just have to know your league and kind of draft accordingly, but it's all in the fun of the game. So let's talk about when people say I have an RB1 or an RB2. What are they talking about? So let's talk about, first off, you have to see what your league size is. It going to be a 10-man league? Is it a 12-man league? Is it a 14-man league? Whatever it is, let's say for just for argument's sake, you have a 12-man league, which is mostly the default type of leagues. An RB1 means a running back who will finish in the top 12 running backs. That's an RB1. An RB2 would be someone who finished between running back 13 and running back 24. Does that make sense? So it's 12 and 12. If it's a 10-man league, then an RB1 would be running backs that are in the top 10, and then running backs from 11 to 20 would be the RB2. So just to kind of give you an idea, when somebody's like, oh, you know, I have 2 RB1s on my team. Well, if he says he has 2 RB1s on his team, that means he has 2 running backs in the top 10 or the top 12 if you have a 12-team league. So it's based on it's league dependent on how many players that you have in your league, and RB1 and RB2 would be that amount of teams. So let's go over another term that we need to talk about, and that's YAC. And YAC is like YAC, yards after the catch. So if a player is really good at, let's say he does like a 5-yard hitch route, catches the ball, he can turn up and get you another 5 yards. That's good. That's YAC. That's yards after the catch. He wants to be able to give you extra fantasy yards or fantasy points. So if somebody has a high YAC rating, then they're going to be able to get you more points after the catch. They're not just somebody who catches the ball and goes down. That's just going to add on to the extra fantasy points for you. And that's going to be somebody that you can really look forward to having on your team, because he's going to produce more fantasy points for you. So now let's go over what people are talking about when they talk about waivers. So waivers is where players cut in most leagues do not immediately become free agents and available for any team just to pick up. Instead, they go on waivers for either a day or more. Now, there's a lot of different types of waivers out there, whether we're talking about FAAB or whether it's, you know, reversed order of the standings, or I know a lot of teams, they're starting to move towards the FAAB, and we're going to go over FAAB. That's going to be our next term we're going to go over. But there are some leagues that go it's reverse order standings or waiver priority. So the highest priority for that week will be the last team in the league. So they want the worst team to get the best free agents. Then we have like waiver priorities, where if you to get somebody off of free agency, and then you go to the bottom of the list, and it kind of like ciphers through like that, things like that. But I think most people are going over to what our next term will be the FAAB system. It is the free agent acquisition budget. Now what that is where it's a waiver wire method pickup, where each team owner is given a budget for that specific season, and that is used to bid on players in free agency. Now, a lot of times they have an in-season and an off-season FAAB budget. Normally it's around $100 each, and then they will take players. So let's just say team owner A and team owner B want this player that was either cut or had a really good week, and they want to pick him up from their team. Well, it's up to you on how much you want to bid. So let's just say this other owner's like, I just want to dip my toes in, and I want to see if I can get him on the cheap, and he bets $10. And then this other owner's like, I really need this on my team. How much do I want to bid on that? I'm going to bid $75 for this guy. Well, when waivers run, mostly on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, whenever your league runs waivers, the guy who bid $75 is going to win that player, because he bid $75 and this guy bet $10. So just because the guy who lost on the free agency, he bet the $10, he doesn't lose that $10. It goes back into his budget. The guy who bet $75, that $75 comes out of his $100 bid that he have, and now he has $25 for the rest of the season. Now, you should be in a league that allows $0 pickups. I really like that. Some leagues it's a minimum of $1, but once you run out of your $100, then you can no longer pick up free agency. I don't really like that, but you can go to the point where you can even bid $1 if you want to get somebody in there. So FAAB is a good way to keep things fair. It's almost like an auction type of draft, where you don't know when anybody's going to be bidding on a player, so you may overbid. You know, knowing this guy only put up 10, this guy could have put up $11 and won the player, but he bid 75. You see what I'm saying? So it's a little bit more fun throughout the season, just to kind of see who all's bidding what. So the next term we're going to go over is kind of the difference between a DEF and a DEF and a DST. So a DEF just stands for defense, and a DST stands for a defense special teams. Now, a lot of times leagues kind of separate this to where if you have a DEF spot, it's going to be, okay, that's just the defense. So if the defense, anybody on the defense gets a sack, you get, let's say there's 2 points. Anybody gets an interception, 2 points, forced fumbles, scoop and score touchdowns, stuff like that. DST normally includes things like punt returns and kick returns. So if somebody runs a kick return back for a touchdown, that DST gets 6 points. If you, for some reason, fumble the ball, you're gonna lose some points. If you get 20 yards kick return, you may get an extra point, things like that. But it's the combination between defense and special teams, and the DEF is normally just the defense. So now let's go over what people are talking about, and a big part of either this channel, a lot of other fantasy football channels, is we're going to talk about breakouts. Now, breakouts is a player who improves significantly. He's a weekly starter with an emphasis of a poor previous performance during his career. So somebody that may have had a bad year, it could have been due to injury. It could have been due to he was in a bad situation. They maybe had somebody else. Whatever the case may have been, people may not even know much about this guy, but it's somebody who just wasn't performing, and you think that this is going to be a guy that's going to boom, he's going to be out there. He's going to be the guy that you're going to want on your team, and he's probably going to be drafted a lot later than normal. So a breakout player is somebody that, if you hear somebody talking about, I have great breakouts this season. Well, what is a breakout? That's that guy who probably had a bad previous season, and he's finally going to get over the hump and be a solid fantasy producer for your fantasy team. Now, the next term we're going to use, and there's another good term for fantasy football, would be a boom or bust. Now, a boom or bust is really an inconsistent player who scores a lot of points one week and very few points the next week. So one of the biggest ones, and not the distance, the not so distant past, would be Will Fuller. Will Fuller was a great boom or bust type of player, where he's either going to get you 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, or he's going to get you probably 1 catch for 5 yards and no touchdown. The boom aspect is he just got you 100 points, 2 touchdowns, and probably helped you win your week. The bust aspect was that he got you nothing. He might have got you a point. So those are the type of players it's good to have. I like maybe 1 boom or bust player on your roster. You don't want to fill out your roster with a bunch of boom or bust players, because if they just so happen to bust, you're guaranteed to lose that week, and you really can't stay consistent on that. Boom or bust players most likely bust more than boom. Just remember that. So the next term that we're going to talk about is a ceiling. So there's 2 terms here. We're going to go back to back, a ceiling and a floor. And I know I've talked about that in a couple of my videos before, but let's talk about what is that? Who is those ceiling type of players? Well, if sometimes you have a ceiling week, a ceiling season, whatever, that just means that is the most fantasy points that he's probably going to average to give you. So let's just say, for example, let's talk about a running back, and maybe his ceiling is 35 fantasy points and his floor would be something else. So the ceiling, the 35 fantasy points, that's probably going to be the most points he's going to get you. So if you're starting 2 players and the ceiling of one player is 35 fantasy points and the other ceiling may be 20, you're going to want to start the higher ceiling type of player depending on your situation. And depending on, let's talk about the next term, and we're talking about the floor. The floor is the least amount of fantasy points he averages per game. Now, there's a lot of players in the NFL who probably average like a 0 type of floor, to where there's a good possibility he's going to give you 0 points for that fantasy season. But let's just say somebody's giving you 35 points a game, his ceiling. And let's just go really gaudy. Let's go 0 points would be a 4. So he can get you to 35 and get you to 0. Classification of a boom or bust player, or somebody that may be giving you 25 points for a ceiling, but giving you 20 points for a floor. So I would probably start the guy who's giving you the 25 point ceiling and 20 point floor more than the 35 point ceiling and the 0 point floor, because you have some safety there. He's going to probably at least get you that 20 point mark. Does that make sense? So you have a floor amount of points that someone's going to get you, and you have a ceiling amount of points that someone's going to get you. And you want to kind of play within those guidelines. You really want to have the highest floor possible. That gives you the safety. The highest ceiling possible is going to get you those boom weeks to really seal the deal. So it's up to you as a fantasy owner to make the right decisions to see who you're going to start, who you're going to sit. And throughout the season in this channel, guys, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button, because we're going to go over some starts and starts of the week, Bayou Bengal starts of the week, locks of the week, all types of stuff to help you set the best lineup possible week in and week out. So let's go over the next term that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about a flex position. I know a lot of people, as part of the roster, you can start so many quarterbacks, so many running backs, so many wide receivers, maybe even tight ends and kickers and defense, but then you have another thing down there called flex. A flex position usually is somebody, you can put anybody in there as long as they are a running back, a wide receiver, or a tight end, you can put them in that slot. So if you have one quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, and a tight end and a flex, well, then you can start 3 running backs if you want. You can start 3 wide receivers, or you can start 2 tight ends if you want, because that flex spot, you can add a running back in there, you can add a wide receiver in there, or you can add a tight end in that spot. So flex positions are really cool. It allows diversity between people's lineups, and it's something you want to look for. And that brings us to the next term, which is a super flex. Super flex leagues are actually becoming super popular now, and that just means you can add a running back, a wide receiver, a tight end, just like a flex position, but it's super flex because you can now also add a quarterback into that flex spot. So a super flex position, you can even start, if you only can start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, two wide receivers, and a tight end, now you can start 2 quarterbacks if you want. And most people score or put quarterbacks in that super flex league because quarterbacks score more points than anybody in the league. So let's go ahead and move on to our next term. We're going to talk about FPPG, which stands for fantasy points per game. So fantasy points per game is something that whoever the player, let's take Jonathan Taylor again, how many points does he average per game? So if he averages 25 points per game, he has a 25 FPPG. So it's just another term that I wanted. It's not very significant. You obviously want the highest FPPG per person. That's going to give you the most chance to win. But other than that, that's pretty much the significance of that term FPPG. I've had some people in the comments before ask me what FPPG was. They were clearly new to fantasy football, and that's what this channel is about, to help the new people. And we're also about to help the veterans, because we're going to win some championships in this league, and in this channel we're going to help you out. That's just how it is. Let's talk about the next team, or the next term that we're going to talk about, and that's going to be a FLIER. What is a FLIER? It really just kind of means that you're taking a chance on somebody, right? So if you're taking a FLIER, maybe it's your last pick in the draft, and you're taking a FLIER on maybe a 6th round draft pick who may be buried on the depth chart. You know, he might be the 5th or 6th wide receiver or the 4th running back. You're taking a FLIER on this guy because you're just taking a chance on this guy of becoming fantasy relevant, somebody that people really don't want to draft, they may not know about, just a random Joe Smo that nobody in the NFL is even projecting to do anything. So you're going to take a FLIER on this guy, just like a chance on this guy, to hopefully he becomes something, and man, you just landed yourself a great player. But that's when somebody says, hey, I'm going to take a FLIER on this guy. They're like, what are you talking about? Well, he just taking a chance on this guy becoming, something relevant. So let's talk about the next term. Let's talk about something really popular, and questions that we get all the time on this channel is about handcuffs. What is a handcuff? A handcuff is normally you handcuff your running back. So if you have a starting, let's just say for last year for the Bengals, you had Joe Mixon was a starting running back, and you had Samaje Perine was his handcuff or second running back on the depth chart. So let's just say if you drafted Joe Mixon, you may later in the draft want to draft Samaje Perine because he's one of the better running backs or second running backs in the draft. So if Joe Mixon goes down, you have the running back to replace him to be the new number 1. That is the handcuff. You're handcuffing your starting running back with the second string running back, just in case there was an injury that happened to that first guy and you have somebody to plug and play. If you don't draft that handcuff and somebody else has him on his team and Joe Mixon goes down, now you're searching for a running back. So there's certain handcuffs you want, certain handcuffs you don't want. You don't want to just draft the second string running back from every team, because if the starter gets hurt, a lot of times the team changes kind of the way they play. They're not going to have the same game strategy, and they're not going to run the tote. So there's people out there like Alexander Madison or Tony Pollard or Samaje Perine that are currently the handcuffs to teams. And I know Tony Pollard is going to be the starting running back starting this year now that they release Ezekiel Elliott. But you see what I'm trying to say. The second string running backs, you want to target those that are really going to give you those big games whenever they do become the starters. But that is what the term means when you're handcuffing your players. The next term we're going to talk about is IDP. What is IDP? Well, IDP is individual defensive players. So that's some of the leagues, they have IDP roster spots where you take turns drafting defensive linemen, defensive backs, things like that. And let's just say you draft a linebacker, and if he makes a tackle, you score 1 or 2 points. If he gets an interception, you get 1 or 2 points. It's different for any league for as far as the scoring, but you get what I mean. You draft individual players. Sometimes it's just 1 D lineman, 1 linebacker, one defensive back. Sometimes they even break it down to safeties and corners and inside linebackers, outside linebackers, defensive tackles, defensive ends. It can go very, very broad as far as a IDP type of leagues. But I don't play in any of those. But you're not going to see any content on this league about on this channel for IDP. But it is a certain rule set and a certain term that a lot of people may need as they're going back. Now, one of the biggest things that we need to talk about, and probably the most frustrating part of fantasy football, is the injuries. The injuries have some labels that we need to talk about, and a lot of people's like, what does that mean if he's probable? What does that mean if he's questionable? Is he going to play? Bayou, is he going to play? I don't know. So let's go over those labels right now. So if you have somebody that is probable, there's probably going to be a 75% chance that that player that's going to play this week. Now, those probable players, those are the ones you definitely want to have in your lineups. They're going to play. Okay, I know it says 75%. That's probably the average. But if they're probable, they're going to play. Okay, now if they're coming off of a devastating injury and they're probable, they may limit their snaps. But overall, if they're probable, you want to get them in your lineup. So the next term we're going to talk about is questionable. Now, there's about a 50% chance that player's going to play. There's doubtful. There's only a 25% chance that they're going to play. And then out, there is a 0% chance that they're going to play that week. Now, each team is required to release an inactive report 90 minutes before the kickoffs. The report shows where, which players are going to be active, which players are going to be inactive, and that's a report that you really need to be paying attention to. Whether or not if you're in Central Time Zone and it's noon, obviously it's going to come out probably around 10:30 in the morning, just whatever an hour and a half is before that, and you want to look at it. Somebody that is doubtful or out, they're never going to be in your lineup. The biggest one is that questionable. That one is 50% chance they're going to play or not. People got to wait on those inactive reports because questionable, you never know what's going to happen. And it comes with a big thing when you have somebody playing on Monday Night Football and he's questionable. What do? You have to make the best decision possible for your fantasy team. Do you bench him just in case he might be injured and not play? You don't know. But injuries is probably one of the biggest things that a lot of people really get frustrated of because they don't know whether or not to start. And sometimes they make the bad decision and sit them and they play and they have a beast game and then you just threw your week away. So let's talk about another terms here. We're talking about redraft versus keeper versus dynasty. These are the type of leagues that a lot of people play in because it goes from redraft, keeper, or dynasty, breaking it down to standard, PPR, or half PPR. These are the biggest things that you want to talk about. Redraft league, what is that? Redraft league normally is you take your turn, you draft your league, or you draft your team, and at the end of the season, all the players get put back into the pool, and the next season you start from scratch and you start drafting again. A keeper league, there's different types of keeper leagues where you can play, you play through the season, you may be able to keep 1 player, 2 player, 3 player. You can keep half your roster. You can do whatever you want. You can probably keep your whole roster if you want to and throw whoever back you want to. And then the next season you draft those players who wasn't kept in your league. So you're able to keep a certain amount of number of players and then everybody else gets thrown in the pool and you do a normal draft after that without those players in it. Now, a dynasty league there is no redrafting in the following season. You have a startup draft, you draft all of your players, and then you keep all of your players, and then the following season, there's only a rookie draft that contains the rookie players coming out. I play in redraft leagues. Right now I play in keeper leagues and dynasty leagues, but we have content on this channel talking about redrafts, keepers, and dynasties. We've got it all on this channel for you. So no matter what type of league you're in, this channel is definitely for you. Again, just another reminder, hit the like button for me. I'd really appreciate it. And hit the subscribe button. We're going to be here for a long time talking about fantasy football and helping prepare you for the season. So let's talk about the next term, and we're going to talk about a mock draft. What is a mock draft? Well, that is a fake draft that's used to practice during strategy and to kind of gauge where players will be picked in actual fantasy drafts. I do mock drafts all the time, every single year. I actually put a few of them on the channel here so you guys can see how I do my mock drafts. It's just another thing to gauge another term we talked about, ADP, right? The mock drafts, you want to see where people are going. Yeah, you can easily look up a list of ADP, but that doesn't reflect really of how you draft. So get into a mock draft and check it out. Preferably not with your teammate or not with your league mates, because you don't want them really know who you value, who you don't. But get into a random mock draft, see how it goes, and start taking the players that you like and seeing who falls to you. You may find out that you have like a player really good in the 5th round, but he keeps getting taken in the 4th. So when the time comes that you're drafting your real team, you may want to take him in the 4th, knowing that most of the time he's not there in the 5th for you. So it kind of helps you gauge ADP and kind of where things are going based on how you draft. And it's going to be a very valuable asset for you if you end up using the mock draft for when the regular season actually happens. So actually, let's talk about the draft a little bit and different types of draft you can go in. And the first one I want to talk about is definitely a snake draft, which is mostly the common types of draft for redrafts and keeper leagues. Snake drafts is where you draft from 1 to however many teams. Let's just say for this example, you have 12 teams in your league. It goes from 1 to 12. And then whoever had the 12th pick has back-to-back picks, because then it goes from 12 to 1. So whoever had the best player in the draft will end up having the 24th best player in the draft as well. So it goes from 1 to 12, 12 to 1, 1 to 12, 12 to 1, and that's how a snake draft goes. Now, if you're playing in a dynasty league, you're going to have probably a linear type of draft, to where, let's say if there's 12 players and it's a rookie draft or whatever the case is, you go from 1 to 12, and then round 2, 1 to 12, round 3, 1 to 12. That's a linear draft. Snake goes back and forth. Linear goes from top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. All right? So that kind of helps you out with that. Next term we're going to go over. Let's talk about a sleeper. Now, a sleeper is an NFL player who someone believes is going to have a breakout season, but may be undervalued in fantasy drafts, or he just may not be very well known. He's somebody that, he's kind of sneaky, he's going under that radar. He could have some type of huge season to where he can become a good starter for you, but not a lot of people have him very high on their draft boards. He's just kind of a sleeper. So that's a really big term in fantasy football and on my channel too. I try to give you a lot of good sleepers, maybe people that aren't really, people are thinking about, he could maybe go in later on in the drafts, and somebody who's really going to have some type of breakout season for you. And again, some people may not even know who this is, but if you're really evaluating depth charts, evaluating training camps, preseasons, are they playing pretty well? Because in the preseason, these sleepers, they're probably going to get a lot of playing time. So just be on the lookout for those, and then we'll kind of talk about that. So let's talk about streaming. Streaming is something that's super popular for defenses, and it's really popular for quarterbacks, and it's really popular for tight ends. Streaming means if I'm going to stream the quarterback position. What does that mean? How are you going to stream the quarterback position? Well, if you don't have a solid stud like a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen or any of these studs that are coming out right now, and you end up with, let's say, Daniel Jones or something in the end of the draft, you may want to say, based on the matchup, start a different quarterback. So let's say week 1, your starter is Daniel Jones. Week 2, the Seahawks have a great matchup against a really bad pass defense, so Geno Smith could be here. So you pick up Geno Smith and start him week 2. It's pretty much the same thing for tight ends or defenses. You find the best matchups, and you start the player based on the matchup, not based on the player talent. Let's say, for instance, you have Patrick Mahomes. It doesn't matter who he's playing. You're starting Patrick Mahomes. But if you get a lower tier type of quarterback, each week you can have a different quarterback, and that's called streaming the position. Now, the last term we're going to talk about today is going to be a zero running back strategy. Now, that's going to be when an owner opts to fade or avoid the running back position early in the draft due to their risks. No running back taken usually in the first 5 rounds. So normally a lot of people do that. They'll really load up on wide receivers, especially in PPR leagues. Load up on these wide receivers, maybe even take a quarterback or so, and maybe in round 6 or so, they finally take their first running back off the board. Now, this was super popular a few years back. It's not being as popular as of right now, but there's plenty of people who use this zero running back strategy, and it can work if you're able to land some of these hot sleepers or breakout player running backs later on in your draft. You got all these studs at the wide receiver position. You just landed yourself a successful season. So overall, all these terms, I just wanted to go over some of these with you. Hopefully it helped you out understand what some of these terms are when people are talking about it and you're like, I don't know what he's talking about. Well, now you can get in there with the big boys, start talking about fantasy football, using the lingo everybody else does, and maybe, just maybe, they think that you know more than you actually do. And they're like, how do you know all this? Be like, well, Bayou Bengals channel, you got to go check them out and look them out. But leave a comment down below. What did you guys think about what we went over today? Is there another term that maybe you're a veteran, there's a term that you believe I didn't cover today that could help out somebody? Let's help out these new guys, get them back, because overall I think if we get everybody better at fantasy football, our leagues are going to be more fun. It's not always fun when you're just blowing out of teams and you're winning championships left and right with no competition. I personally like to have, in my 12 team leagues, 12 teams that know what they're doing and it's competitive. It's just more exciting that way. But anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. Be sure we're coming out with a huge how-to series here as we start releasing these videos to kind of help out all these new players, really get their game up, so that way we can all have a more fun type of season. As always, I appreciate you guys watching that video. Hit the subscribe button, leave comments and the like, you know all the good stuff. I can't wait to see you guys on the next video. We'll see you guys next time.